Our ancient ancestors were just as inventive as we are. If it weren't for the things they invented thousands of years ago, we wouldn't be able to keep inventing things today. In fact, they were so good at inventing things that we still don't fully understand some of their weirdest and most wonderful inventions. Let's check some of them out. When is a map not a map? Well, how about when it's a storytelling aid? In 1885, a Danish team of explorers led by Gustav Holm made its way around the eastern coast of Greenland. During their journey, Holm met a local Inuit hunter called Knut. The two men engaged in a trade, with Holm giving Knut basic supplies and Knut giving Holm these wooden maps. The curious-looking artifacts are a rough representation of the coastline north of Ammasalak, a small Inuit settlement that Knut lived in. The larger of the two maps represents the coastline, while the smaller one represents the islands offshore. They're not entirely accurate, but that doesn't matter because they were never intended to be used for navigation. Instead, they're a striking example of Greenland's Inuit culture. These maps were actually used for storytelling. An Inuit hunter could point to areas of the map while telling their fishing or hunting stories, thus helping their audience to visualize the tale. If the maps have any practical use at all, it's the fact that the deep grooves indicate paths where a hunter has to carry a kayak for long distances over land, thus providing information for anyone who might consider following their path. When it's sunny outside, you might consider wearing sunglasses to protect your eyes from the brightness of our native star. We associate sunglasses with hot weather, but it's sometimes just as important to wear them when it's cold. That's why snow goggles are a vital tool in the arsenal of every Arctic explorer, and they're an older invention than you might imagine. This pair of Inuit snow goggles is currently in the collection of the Science Museum in London, England. They're made of rawhide and pine, with tiny slits in the rawhide that allow the wearer to see where they're going. They even have a handy wooden case for the owner to keep them in. They'd still be useful for protecting your vision in the snowiest reaches of North America today, which is remarkable when you consider the fact that they were made in 1801. Most modern sunglasses are fashion items, but when these were made, their inventors were more concerned about health and safety. Silomme Tunnel is a remarkable feat of ancient engineering. It's an artificial water tunnel that was carved in the city of David on the outskirts of Jerusalem in the 8th century. We know the work was done during the 8th century BCE because of the Silomme inscription, which details the construction process and confirms it was created by two teams who started excavating from either end and met in the middle. From the several kinks in the tunnel, it's clear that a few directional errors were made before the workers arrived on the right path. Some people believe that the Silomme Tunnel is the conduit referenced in 2 Kings 20:20 in the Hebrew Bible, although that can't be proven. The tunnel runs from the Pool of Siloam to the Gihon Spring, and was most likely built during a time when Jerusalem was anticipating an imminent attack from the Assyrians. More water would have been required for the city to sustain itself during a siege, and the tunnel would have provided it. From end to end, the tunnel is 1/3 of a mile long. Considering that it was carved using hand tools, that's incredible. Iron smelting is a dangerous process even when it's carried out in blast furnaces today. It was arguably even more dangerous more than 1,000 years ago, unless you happen to live in Sri Lanka, where an ingenious new technique for iron smelting in either the 9th or 10th century was discovered. The Sri Lankans came up with a sort of forced draft shaft furnace. Effectively, it's an iron smelting facility powered by the wind. There are several such furnaces in and around Samanalawiwa, all of which are positioned on the western sides of hills and ridges, where they would often be exposed to high winds during monsoons. The regular wind wouldn't be strong enough to power these ingenious furnaces, but monsoon winds would be enough to produce high-quality, high-carbon steel. Archaeological evidence at Samanalawiwa suggests that this was once the dominant industry in the region and might have made a significant contribution to South Asia's early mastery of steel production. While we might have called it relatively safe a few moments ago, we must point out that the people who worked at these furnaces would have had to have stood outside during monsoons, so perhaps it wasn't so safe after all. Is it possible that the ancient Indians knew how to produce electricity 3,000 years ago? The idea sounds preposterous, but we invite you to consider the contents of an ancient document called Agastya Samhita. It's currently in the Prince's Library in Ujjain. The document not only explains how to create an electric battery, but also how the battery can be used to split water into its component gases. The battery is made of a copper plate, copper sulfate, wet sawdust, and zinc powder inside an earthen pot. The text says that readers should place the plate into the vessel, cover it in copper sulfate and moist sawdust, and place the zinc powder on top. The resultant energy is called Mitra Varuna. Versions of the battery have been built and tested by modern scientists and proven to produce an open circuit voltage of 1.138. Returning to the text of the Agastya Samhita, it's suggested that chaining 100 such pots together is enough to change water into oxygen and hydrogen, although obviously the two gases aren't referred to by name. There's no doubt that the Indians knew how to make electricity. They just couldn't come up with a better use for it than this. If you thought that the hand grenade was an invention of the First or Second World War, we have news for you. To discover the origin of the hand grenade, you have to go back a lot further than the 20th century. Try the 7th century instead, which is when Greek fire was used on the enemies of the Byzantine Empire. This ancient hand grenade isn't from the 7th century, it's from the 14th. But we've chosen it because it looks so much like the devices that are used in modern times. The clay grenade is acorn-shaped, and even has a hole at the top for a fuse to be inserted. It would have been filled to the top with a flammable liquid, and then hurled at enemy ships to cause as much damage as possible. This particular example was found off the coast of Israel in 2016, and is thought to be a leftover from the Crusades. The flammable liquid inside it was probably alcohol, so it wouldn't have been as destructive as the grenades of today, but it would still pose a huge risk to a wooden boat. If you needed a high-quality sword during the Middle Ages, you'd insist that your sword maker fashioned your weapon out of Wootz steel, also known as Damascus steel. It was known as the hardest steel in the world at the time, but its origins go back much earlier than the Middle Ages. It's another Indian invention, and it began there more than 1,000 years before anyone else discovered the recipe and the process for making it. Damascus steel is a type of crucible steel, by which we mean it's made by melting all the ingredients together in a crucible mold and then pouring it into a cast. It's possible that the word Wootz is a corruption of the South Indian word uku, which means steel. The first record of the word in the English language comes from the late 18th century. By then, the Indians had been making it for about 2,000 years. The quality of Indian steel is even referred to in the records of Alexander the Great. It's thought that the secret of how to make Damascus steel was protected and passed down from father to son, rather than being written anywhere. That allowed India to monopolize the production and export of the metal for hundreds of years. Some archaeological discoveries hide in plain sight. There's been a huge stone wall running 71 miles in the west of Iran for at least 1,600 years, but nobody's ever bothered to pay it any attention before. In terms of length and size, it's comparable to the famous Hadrian's Wall built in Great Britain by the ancient Romans, but doesn't enjoy any of that wall's profile or recognition. Experts say that more than 35 million square feet of stone would have been used to build the wall, which would require a huge workforce here and now, let alone back then. At various points along the wall, traces of pottery have been found, as well as remnants of old structures and buildings which have almost totally crumbled away. Interestingly, although the existence of the wall has never been recorded in any official document, people who live close to it have been aware of it for generations and call it the Gowery Wall, although the origin of the name is unknown. We have no idea who built it or why it was built, but from what little remains, we can say that it was likely 10 feet high and 13 feet thick, so it may have had defensive properties. Logic, science, and history all tell us that human beings weren't capable of powered flight until the early years of the 20th century. Mythology tells us otherwise. According to a whole host of different and independently written Sanskrit and Hindi texts, the oldest of which dates back over 3,500 years, the ancient residents of India took to the skies as the pilots of flying vessels called Vimmanas. A text known as the Veda provides a compellingly detailed description of a Vimmana, telling us that they had a wheel, a control panel, 12 pillars, and more than 300 pivot joints with full articulation. Apparently, they generated a trail of flames as they lifted off from the ground. Both the Mahabharata and Ramayana texts specify that ownership of a Vimmana was a privilege restricted to the ruling class. We don't have any physical evidence for the existence of Vimmanas, and it's easy to write them off as a fabrication. But it's puzzling that so many ancient writers claim to be first-hand eyewitnesses of their capabilities. On the other hand, why would technology that allowed humans to fly suddenly be forgotten for thousands of years? No piece of medieval machinery or technology was more advanced than the Toquetum, although calling it medieval can be controversial. Jabir ibn Afla is generally credited with the invention of the Toquetum in the 12th century, but references to a Toquetum-like device appear in the ancient records of ancient Egyptian mathematician Ptolemy. It's thought that the idea of a Toquetum might have occurred to Ptolemy, but he never got around to making one. A Toquetum is an astronomy aid capable of recording astronomical coordinates in 3 different ways: elliptic, equatorial, and relative to the horizon. Once measurements are taken, the device can convert data between the 3 classifications without the user having to do any further work. It's like a computer that doesn't require plugging in or updating. Sadly, no surviving examples of Toquetums from Jabir ibn Afla's time are known to exist in the world today. The oldest ones we have date back to the 16th century. It was so far ahead of its time as an invention that it remained in use until the 18th century, by which time some people had them made out of gold. The fact that our ancient ancestors knew so much about how to manipulate and manage the flow of water never fails to impress us. Here, we see an ancient system of aqueducts that's recently been discovered in Burujerd, Iran. The entire elaborate system was built as a part of a castle and was found accidentally during construction work in the area. It's thus far proved to be impossible to provide an accurate date for the aqueducts, but they're so old that they used pottery crocks as a way of purifying the water. That's a very old but very effective trick. History tells us that Burujerd was once a heavily fortified town surrounded by almost 60 towers, with a series of castles within it. This particular castle may even have belonged to the local government, which would explain why its builders went out of their way to ensure it had a ready supply of clean water. The pipes are delicate, which has left archaeologists with a problem. Should they attempt to break the pipes apart and take them away for further study, or should they leave them in situ? They haven't reached a final decision yet, so they're doing all they can to study them while they're still in place. The art of building bridges was an important skill for humans to learn as their territories spread and rivers got in the way. Most people would probably assume that it began with the Romans, the Egyptians, or the Greeks, but it actually appears to have started around 5,000 years ago in the ancient Sumerian city of Girsu, which is now part of Iraq. The waterway it crossed has long since dried up and gone away, which initially made the remains of the bridge difficult to identify. When they were first discovered during the 1920s, it was generally thought that they were either the remains of an ancient dam or the foundations of a larger building, like a temple. It wasn't until a 21st century exploration unearthed clay tablets in the surrounding area, upon which references were made to the existence of a bridge nearby. Archaeologists have now concluded that this structure is the bridge they speak of. It's made out of baked bricks and appears to have been made one brick at a time in a process that may have taken years. As the site was previously considered to be unimportant, it's been left unprotected and exposed to the elements for decades. So the race is now on to preserve it in a manner befitting the world's oldest bridge. We tend to think of nanoscience as a recent field of study, but there's some evidence that our ancient ancestors had at least a passing understanding of it thousands of years ago. We can say that with confidence because of a 2006 study into an ancient hair dye that was used to darken hair in Egypt more than 4,000 years ago. The research was carried out by French scientist Dr. Philippe Walter of the National Center for Scientific Research in Paris, in conjunction with L'Oréal. They proved that the ancient Egyptians used a form of wet chemistry to synthesize lead chloride compounds and then added them to lead sulfide to create a black pigment, creating nanocrystals of galena. The substance was mixed with water to create a paste and then applied to the hair, where it reacted with naturally occurring keratins in the hair to produce the dark shade. It's highly unlikely that these Egyptian chemists fully understood the reasons why the process worked, but they can't have arrived at the method by accident, and so they must have been skilled researchers. Speaking of ancient nanotechnology, we can also see evidence of it in the creation of 1st century ceramics from Corsica. This practice appears to have developed on the island during the Iron Age, using asbestos fibers taken from the island's northeast to reinforce traditional ceramics with a crude form of nanofiber coating. Asbestos would be split by smashing it with pebbles and then mixing with raw clay paste to create ceramic objects before firing them in a sort of rustic oven. The ceramics in question have only ever been discovered in the same part of the island, suggesting that knowledge of the method was limited only to a very small number of people, and was forgotten about when those people either died out or moved on. Formal scientific research regarding the potential of nanofibers for reinforcing ceramics wasn't carried out until 1838, when French ceramist A. Bronard wrote a paper on the subject before going on to found the French National Museum of Ceramics. The idea that people living 1800 years earlier could have had an understanding as good as, if not better, than his, is truly mind-blowing. The magnetic compass is also an invention that's far more ancient than most people assume it to be. It was created in China and probably came around by accident. Ancient Chinese soothsayers used lodestones to create fortune-telling boards and quickly came to realize that their lodestones always pointed north, thus enabling the invention of the navigational compass. The first record of such a device appears in the manuscript Wu Qing Song Yao, which was written in the year 1040 and included references to a device known as the iron fish, which would point to the north when suspended in water. A Song Dynasty-era book from the same year also refers to magnetic devices used in land navigation. It wasn't until the 14th century that the idea reached Europe, where it was first recorded in Amalfi, Italy, probably by someone who'd either acquired one or seen one in action while traveling through the Far East. Based on this, the Chinese must have had a big advantage over other civilizations when it came to navigation for more than 300 years. No wonder they were so successful. But how did they come up with the idea so much earlier than anyone else did? While the examples of amazing ancient technology we've looked at so far operate on the small scale, our next example is enormous. To find it, we have to look at the Yangshan Quarry in China, which is where much of the stone used in Nanjing's great monuments was quarried. Not all of the stone that was quarried, cut, and shaped here was moved elsewhere though. Some of it, like this colossal unfinished stele, is still here. History tells us that the creation of the stele was ordered by the Yongle Emperor during the 15th century, who wanted to use it in a monument to honor his father at the Ming Shaoling Mausoleum. Workers got around to carving out the head, base, and body of the stele before appearing to give up, no doubt somewhat overawed by the size of their creation. The body is 30 feet wide, 15 feet thick, and 150 feet tall. We have almost no idea how they could possibly have carved something so enormous, and there's zero chance they'd ever have been able to transport it. We can't help but wonder what convinced them that such a thing might have been possible in the first place. Our next surprising piece of ancient technology is also Chinese. It's a form of refrigerator, and it's over 2,500 years old. The ancient Chinese text known as Shi Jing, also sometimes called the Book of Poems, tells us that refrigerator technology existed during the time of the Warring States in the 5th century BCE. Modern refrigerators rely on having access to electricity, but this clever device was little more than a box made of bronze and copper, separated into an inner container and an outer container. Anything you want to keep cool for preservation, meat, for example, was placed in the inner container. The gap between the inner and outer containers was then filled with ice, and the whole box was covered with a lid to help retain the temperature inside. The versatile device could also be used for the opposite reason. You could add hot water instead of ice to keep the contents of the inner container warm. Whenever examples of the devices have been found, they've always been noted to be covered with ornate carvings and inscriptions, suggesting that this technology was off limits to all but China's wealthiest residents. While the ancient Romans tend to be thought of as the pioneers of advanced irrigation thanks to their attractive aqueducts, many of which are still standing today, that honor should, by rights, go to the ancient residents of Algeria. That's because the irrigation system in the Algerian region of Adrar, known as Quinat or Folgara, is one of the oldest examples of sophisticated hydraulic engineering in the world. Folgaras were created by digging out tunnels beneath slopes, usually hillsides or mountainsides, that allow fresh water to run in a controlled path down the side of the slope and form a pool wherever the creators of the Folgara wanted it to be. It's like an aqueduct, but it's below the ground rather than above it. The first of them is thought to have been created in Persia around 2,100 years ago, but the one in Adrar is by far the most impressive in terms of scale. Sadly, it's every bit as endangered as it is impressive. Modern-day schools and hospitals have been built on top of the path of the Folgara, but the creation of the Folgara weakened the ground, and so the buildings are slowly sinking. A race against time has now begun to find a way to preserve the buildings and the ancient irrigation system without damaging either of them. Binary code is the base language of computers, and yet it predates them by centuries. German mathematician Gottfried Leibniz is generally credited with inventing binary code in 1703, but in reality, the concept of binary is even older than that. In recent years, we've seen compelling evidence that binary code was used and understood in both ancient India and ancient Polynesia thousands of years ago. On the Polynesian island of Mangariva, a binary system combining base 2 and base 10 was in use by the year 1450, with a binary system used for every number higher than 10, save for 20, 40, and 80, which are referred to by one-word terms in the Mangarevan language. Even older than that is the ancient text Chahanda Shastra, written by the Indian scholar Pingala almost 2,000 years ago. The name of the text translates into English as Science of Stanzas, and within it, Pingala uses light and heavy to describe musical syllables in exactly the same way 0 and 1 are used in binary. Some people even credit Pingala with the invention of the mathematical concept of zero. Building anything in a part of the world that's prone to earthquakes is a risky endeavor. Unless you put something into the structure to protect it from earthquakes, you might have to rebuild the whole thing from scratch in the aftermath of such an event. While that's been a problem for structural engineers all over the world for centuries, it was never an issue in ancient China, thanks to the invention of brackets called dugongs. These wooden brackets have been keeping old timber Chinese buildings standing for more than 2,500 years. As we've seen with many other ancient Chinese inventions, it took the rest of the world hundreds of years to catch up with the concept. A dugong is made from a complicated set of interlocking beams, each of which is cut to a precise measurement to serve its purpose. The more beams are used in the design, the better the weight of the building is distributed. That reduces the risk of any individual element cracking or splitting, and so dampens the impact of an earthquake. Dugongs aren't sunken into the earth or otherwise supported. They stand freely on the ground, with no other fortifications necessary. They're not even held together with glue or any other bonding agent. They're a miracle of ancient ingenuity, and they're too advanced for many modern minds to comprehend properly. Every time you clean your teeth, remember to thank the ancient Egyptians. They came up with the idea, and they also invented toothpaste. Many dentists study an ancient Egyptian recipe for toothpaste while they're training, and they're often surprised by its complexity and efficiency. That particular formula comes from the 4th century, but Egyptians were brushing their teeth long before that. In fact, we believe they used a paste formula to brush their teeth with their fingers 5,000 years ago before toothbrushes were invented. The toothpaste recipe that dentists will be more familiar with is etched onto a papyrus document at the National Library in Vienna, Austria. It describes a paste made of rock salt, mint, pepper, and Irish flour, crushed together and mixed with water. The resultant product smells pungent and isn't particularly appetizing, but the parchment promises readers that it's perfect for maintaining white teeth. It's not as effective as the leading brands you'll find on the market today, but it's a lot more efficient than some of the soap-based kinds of toothpaste that were still in use as recently as 100 years ago. Music has been around for as long as there have been people, but it would be natural for you to assume that electronically generated music is a far more recent invention, possibly starting with the electric guitars of the 1930s. In truth, the first electric device capable of making music was the Telarmonium, also known as the dynamophone, as created by Thaddeus Cahill in 1896. Cahill's groundbreaking device was capable of generating electric sounds and transmitting them through wires to horns, which acted as speakers. As Cahill excitedly pointed out when he unveiled his creation to the world, it would even be possible to broadcast the sounds directly down telephone wires. The Telarmonium used tone wheels to create sounds, which makes it a forerunner to the Hammond organ. Sadly for Cahill, his idea didn't capture the hearts of the public. That had a lot to do with the size of the devices. Each one would easily fill a room and weighed more than 200 tons. Nobody was willing to pick up the bill for mass production, and so he was forced to stop making them after completing 3 prototypes. The last of them was destroyed in 1962. The invention of the steam train changed the face of travel and made it possible for human beings to get from one side of a country to another faster than ever before. That invention would never have been possible had Hero of Alexandria not come up with the alopile, also known as Heron's engine, 2,000 years ago. This engine design should look familiar to anyone who's ever studied a steam engine. It's a sphere that's kept in perpetual motion by boiling water, which in turn emits steam from nozzles on its surface and generates pressure that can be turned into energy. In his early designs for the alopile, the boiling water was positioned below the steel sphere, but Hero later found a way to move it inside and make the design more efficient. What he couldn't do, however, is come up with a practical use for his creation, and so he stopped developing it any further. It wouldn't be until Taqi al-Din studied Hero's work and began to refine it during the 17th century that its potential became clear, and not until 100 years after that in the United Kingdom that the steam train was finally born. Hero's idea was a good one, but it was 1800 years before its time. Tattoos are more fashionable in most parts of the world now than they have been in decades, but we're not sure that would be the case if people still had to get their tattoos via the method that was used in North America 2,000 years ago. This spiky device, which is in storage at Washington State University, was probably a painful thing to have applied to your skin. It's made of pear cactus spines tied to a wooden handle and wrapped in yucca leaf, and it was used to tattoo the Pueblo people who once lived in what's now the southeast of Utah. What's curious is that no evidence of tattooing has been found on the skin or bones of any ancient Pueblo bodies located so far, and nor is there any mention of tattooing in the few written or drawn records we have of their culture. We do know the ancient people of North America had tattoos, though, because of other cactus-based tools found in places like New Mexico and Arizona. In those cases, though, the tools were made over 1,000 years after this one. We wonder if people were getting tattoos of stars, roses, skulls, and Chinese symbols even back then.